Hello everyone, welcome to a lecture on Nietzsche's Peaks, Abysses, and Songs. This lecture is a follow-up to the lecture on Nietzsche's meta-existential knowledge and his core teachings. The primary purpose here will be to explore some of the most interesting ideas as presented in Book 3 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, particularly the vision and the riddle and the convalescent, as well as the conclusion of Book 3 of the Great Yearning, the Other Dance Song, the Midnight Song, and of the Seven Seals. I would not recommend attempting this lecture unless you've listened to the other one first. We'll also be examining Heidegger's reading of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in an essay, Who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra?, as well as what becomes of the eternal recurrence doctrine in Nietzsche's later writings, particularly the Lenza Heide fragment. Key themes for this lecture include Nietzsche on depression, convalescence, the history of nihilism, healing, suffering, and the circle. And it's titled Nietzsche's Peaks, Abysses, and Songs to highlight the unity of these thematic dimensions in Nietzsche's thought. Let's begin with Nietzsche's first concerted communication of the doctrine of eternal recurrence in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in the chapter on the vision and the riddle. To you, bold searchers, researchers, and whoever put to terrible seas with cunning sails, to you, the riddle drunk, the twilight happy, whose souls are lured by flutes to every maelstrom, because you do not want to probe along a thread with cowardly hands, and because where you can divine, there you hate to deduce. To you alone I tell the riddle that I saw, the riddle of the loneliest one. At this point, Zarathustra begins his hike up the mountain, a path that mounted defiantly through boulders and rubble, a wicked, solitary path, and here we again meet the spirit of gravity, or heaviness. Upward, despite the spirit that drew it towards the abyss, the spirit of gravity, my devil and arch-enemy. As Zarathustra ascends, the half-dwarf, half-mole, crippled and crippling, pours leaden drops into his ears and leaden thoughts into his brain. Oh, Zarathustra, he said mockingly, syllable by syllable, you stone of wisdom, you have thrown yourself high, but every stone must fall. Oh, Zarathustra, you projectile, you star destroyer, you have thrown yourself thus high, but every stone that is thrown must fall, condemned by yourself and your own star throwing. Far indeed have you thrown your stone, but it will fall back onto you. Thereupon the dwarf fell silent, but his silence oppressed. And Zarathustra climbed and dreamed and thought. But everything was oppressive, the courage that destroys every discouragement in me. This courage at last bade me stop and say, Dwarf, you are I, but I am the stronger of us two. You do not know my abysmal thought. That you could not endure. And then something occurred which lightened me, for the dwarf jumped from my shoulder, the inquisitive dwarf, and he squatted down upon a stone in front of me. But a gateway stood just there where we had halted. Behold this gateway, dwarf, I went on. It has two aspects. This long lane behind us, it goes on for an eternity. And that long lane ahead of us, that is another eternity. They are in opposition to one another, these paths. They abut on one another. And it is here at this gateway that they come together. The name of this gateway is written above. The moment. But if one were to follow them further, and ever further and further, do you think, dwarf, that these paths would be in eternal opposition? Everything straight lies, murmured the dwarf disdainfully. All truth is crooked, and time itself is a circle. Spirit of gravity, I said angrily, do not treat this too lightly, or I shall leave you squatting where you are, lame foot, for I have carried you high. Behold this moment. From this gateway moment, a long eternal lane runs back, and eternity lies behind us. Must not all things that can have run already run along this lane? Must not all things that can happen have already happened, been done, and passed? And if all things have been before, what do you think of this moment, dwarf? Must not this gateway too have been here before? And are not all things bound fast together in such a way that this moment draws after it all future things, and therefore draws itself too? For all things that can run must also run once again forward along this lane, and this slow spider that creeps along the moonlight, and this moonlight itself, and I and you and this gateway, whispering together, whispering of eternal things. Must we not have all been here before? And must we not return and run down the other lane before us, down that long, terrible lane? Must we not return eternally? Thus I spoke more and more softly, for I was afraid of my own thoughts and reservations. Then suddenly I heard a dog howling nearby. Ho! As Ansel Pearson writes, no sooner is the secret of eternal recurrence, Zarathustra's abysmal thought, finally hinted at, than, by way of confirmation, Zarathustra has an experience of déjà vu, or strictly speaking, déjà entendu. The scene shifts abruptly, as if in a dream. The spirit of gravity disappears, and in his place a young shepherd writhes with a snake in his mouth, until, bidden by Zarathustra, he bites the snake's head off and immediately becomes a transformed being, surrounded with light and laughing. Zarathustra offers no interpretation of these events and simply challenges the sailors to solve his riddle. Ansel Pearson also notes when we read the chapter on the spirit of gravity, we hear more about the dwarf as one who champions moral values that are heteronymous and universal, a good for all and an evil for all, whereas Zarathustra acknowledges the primacy of autonomous personal values and individual taste. So what does the riddle mean exactly? To answer this question, we must note that there are many serpents in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, above all Zarathustra's spirit animal, as well as a green snake later in the work. Here we find the thick black snake hanging from the mouth and attached to the throat of the young shepherd. Who is the young shepherd, and who is the thick black snake? The most comprehensive interpretations of the vision and the riddle chapter can be found in these two books, T.K. Sung's Nietzsche's Epic of the Soul, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and The Death of Nietzsche's Zarathustra by Paul S. Loeb, as well as Lawrence Lambert's Nietzsche's Teaching and Interpretation of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In a way, the thick black snake is the specter of nihilism which haunts Zarathustra's future. Lambert underlines that the snake is everything heaviest and blackest, and when the shepherd bites off its head, he becomes something no longer human, for he is capable of laughing as never yet on earth a human being has laughed. The heavy black snake symbolizes Zarathustra's fear, and he takes issue with Heidegger's interpretation that the snake is nihilism, for it is also an implication of eternal return. Contra Lampert here, that the snake is associated with eternal recurrence, may be precisely what makes it nihilistic according to the terms of Nietzsche's later thinking about his own doctrine, as we'll see in a minute in the Lenza Heide notebooks. Sung's and Loeb's interpretations are exceedingly complex. Noteworthy, however, is how Sung associates the dwarf with the snake and the earth. Heidegger says the dwarf runs away, Lampert says the dwarf is crushed by Zarathustra's talk, and Loeb points out that Zarathustra never sees the dwarf killed, but only wonders where the dwarf is gone. Sung agrees with Loeb's thesis, therefore, that the dwarf has turned into the snake, where the snake is not simply a timeline, but the flow of life itself. The snake and the dwarf are heavy because they stand for the chthonic forces of life, the snake being the symbol of nature in its most pristine force. Sung also underlines how Wagnerian dwarfs are denizens of the underworld, but Zarathustra's dwarf arises from the depth of the earth, Mother Nature, and so is a changeable symbol of life. And this is indeed a remarkable relationship between the dwarf or spirit of gravity and Zarathustra. Even though their relationship is conflictual, the dwarf is still a companion for Zarathustra's ascent to the height. That is, being willing to carry the dwarf up high symbolizes Zarathustra's will to spiritualize chthonic forces. The fact that the dwarf is also described as my devil and arch-enemy underlines in part the futility of this quest and the dwarf's right to taunt Zarathustra. Lastly, Sung argues that the dwarf is Zarathustra's physical self, or embodiment of heteronymous will, and this is the moment in Thus Spoke Zarathustra where the Faustian quest for an autonomous will transforms into a Spinozan mode, that is, a struggle within the heteronymous will for immanence. In Jungian terms, the dwarf is the shadow, the darkest part of the self that is projected to the external world, because the self subconsciously wants to disown it. Many commentators say the dwarf's own account of the eternal ring is too false or shallow, and that it is refuted or amended by Zarathustra's exposition. Carl Jung is the only exception to this standard trend. In his view, it is the dwarf who makes an original pronouncement on eternal recurrence, and Zarathustra only assimilates it in spite of his pretense. Regarding the dwarf's pronouncement, Jung writes, "This is great language, and Zarathustra assimilates it, but he dilutes it and thinks that they are his own ideas. But the dwarf has brought up these ideas in Zarathustra. These terse pronouncements of monumental short words of wisdom come from the intestines of the world." Noting that the words of the dwarf are as terse and profound as those of Lao Tzu, Pythagoras, and Heraclitus. Sung goes on to substantiate Jung's unfashionable view at length. I agree with Sung's interpretation, but don't think we can too easily dismiss Heidegger's interpretation of the black snake as nihilism. In fact, nihilism, eternal recurrence, and nature all come together in Nietzsche's account of his heaviest thought. Moving from the heights of Zarathustra's and the shepherd's liberation from the dwarf, or Zarathustra's peak, we must turn as well to Zarathustra's abyss, and to the intimate connection between eternal recurrence and nihilism. A few years after Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche indeed reflected anew on his core teaching, the eternal recurrence, and its connection with the history of nihilism in an important notebook known as the Lensa fragment. Ansel Pearson writes, "These notes were composed, in fact, only a few weeks before Nietzsche began writing The Genealogy of Morals. And they show how for Nietzsche to be a nihilist in a spiritual and cultural sense is to be in a relatively well-off position. Taken on a psychological level, it is a necessary effect of the decline in belief in God. Man's aversion to existence has not become any greater in previous times. It is simply that we moderns have come to doubt that there is any meaning in suffering and in existence itself. For us moderns, one extreme position is succeeded by another equally extreme, one that construes everything as if it were in vain. It is this in vain which constitutes the character of present-day nihilism. For modern-day nihilism, characterized by this in vain with no aim or purpose, duration is the most paralyzing thought. According to Ansel Pearson, by 1887, eternal recurrence is now construed as a response to this European problem of nihilism. In Nietzsche's words in the Lensa fragment, let us think this thought in its most terrible form, existence as it is, without sense or aim, but inevitably returning, without a finale in nothingness, the eternal return. Here, eternal recurrence has become a response to the problem of the in vain and how we interpret duration. If all final aims and goals or the finale of life is taken away, we are confronted with the nothingness and the prospect of the meaningless returning eternally. And thus, in the Lensa fragment, Nietzsche considers his own eternal recurrence doctrine to be the most extreme form of nihilism, and even as a kind of European Buddhism. As Nietzsche writes, it is a peculiarly European form of Buddhism, and all the energy of knowledge compels us to arrive at this position. It is therefore on this level the most scientific of all possible hypotheses. We deny final goals. Conceived in these quasi-cosmological terms, eternal recurrence becomes an utterly nihilistic thought, a thought that pushes nihilism to its limits. Nietzsche concludes this notebook on an enigmatic note by asking what the spiritually mature being would think of eternal recurrence. And it is from here that many interpretations which seek to dismiss eternal recurrence and prioritize will to power as Nietzsche's most mature philosophy get their impetus. The Lensa fragment, an interpretation of nature, the black serpent and dwarf, in terms of the nihilistic dimensions of eternal return, would be considered Nietzsche's abyss. Nietzsche even goes so far as to oppose eternal recurrence to pantheism. Nietzsche notes that pantheism, too, in its affirmation that everything is perfect, divine, and eternal, likewise forces belief in eternal recurrence. But does it make sense to imagine a God beyond good and evil? Would pantheism in this sense be possible? For the later Nietzsche, if we remove finality from the process, can we nevertheless still affirm the process? And this would only be the case if something within the process were being achieved at every moment and always the same. Spinoza reached such an affirmative position to the extent that every moment has a logical necessity. But this for Nietzsche was just an individual case. The affirmative character of eternal recurrence having less to do in Nietzsche with the total character of the world than with the fundamental characteristics of every moment of existence in general, and whether we feel these fundamental characteristics of the moment to be good, valuable, and pleasurable, or their opposite. The struggle with nihilism is ultimately defined in Nietzsche as our struggle with the will to nothingness, or what Freud would call the death drive. The will to destruction is a will of an even deeper instinct, an instinct of self-destruction that Nietzsche names the will to nothingness. How will humanity be able to overcome the will to nothingness in itself? And who will prove stronger or better suited for this task? And what would such a one think of eternal recurrence? Are the major questions posed in the Lenza Haida fragment. In order to attempt to answer them, we can now look to perhaps the most important chapter in all of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Convalescent. It's there that we find Zarathustra attempting to awaken his abyss or most abysmal thought, and failing in the process, thereby needing healing and care from his animals, convalescence or nostos towards home, before embarking on the pinnacle of the meditation in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which are Zarathustra's songs. In approaching the Convalescent, our first stop will be Heidegger's interpretation in Who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which focuses on this chapter in particular. Beginning from the subtitle of the work as a whole, a book for everyone and no one, Heidegger underlines that everyone means for every human being, insofar as they are a human being. That is, insofar as they become for themselves a matter worthy of thought. This accounts already for the rarefied atmosphere of the book, since most readers will probably fall under the no one designation here, that is, as curiosity mongers who wash in with the tide and imbibe freely of particular passages. What we must do is search for the word of Nietzsche's thought, or logos. And when we do this, we find in the Convalescent in particular a very particular definition of Zarathustra as the advocate of three things, principally life, suffering, and the circle. Zarathustra is not a prophet and perhaps not even a philosopher, but rather in the first instance a speaker. Of what sort? An orator. Maybe a preacher? No, the speaker is an advocate, ein Fürsprecher, speaking on behalf of something. Of what? Of life, suffering, and the circle. This language of advocacy begins to appear quite strongly in the notebooks that Nietzsche penned around this time, which you can find unpublished fragments from the period of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There we read of Nietzsche himself, I am the advocatus diaboli and God's accuser. That is, one who speaks on behalf of the devil, since everything good came out of something evil. Furthermore, in these notes we read, it was not the devil or the ugliest man who killed God per se, but God killed God. And in the summer of 1882, the time has come when the devil must be God's advocate, at least if he himself wants to continue to exist. Very curiously, Nietzsche as an advocatus diaboli, and despite the death of God, seems to be advocating precisely on the behalf of God. And it is in this context that we get an introduction to the spirit of gravity. Did you see your devil? Yes, ponderous, serious, profound, thorough, pathetic. He stood there just like the genius gravitationis, by which all beings and things fall. On this interpretation, the dwarf as the devil or arch-nemesis spirit of gravity is in fact an advocate of God and holding the advocate to account, being an episode in his self-overcoming. As well, very biblically in these notes we hear, wherever the tree of knowledge stands is still paradise, as well as the famous phrase, I would only believe in a God who knows how to dance. A side note here, it was during penning these notebooks that Nietzsche was undergoing an emotional crisis over the breakup of his ménage à trois with Luz Salome and Paul Ray. Little known, but at this time he began to advocate for polyamory, stating in an aphorism, monogamous love is a kind of barbarism perpetrated at the expense of all others and damaging to knowledge. Rather, you should love many, then love forces you to be just to each lover, and thus to know each lover. Loving many is the way to knowledge. Heidegger asks what the title convalescent, der Genesende, means, and notes that genesen is the same word as the Greek neomai, nostos, meaning to head home, from which we get the modern nostalgia, a yearning to go home, or homesickness, Heimweh. For Heidegger, the convalescent is the one who is getting ready to turn homewards, that is, to turn towards what defines him. The convalescent is underway to himself so that he can say of himself who he is. Thus Zarathustra discovers who he is, I, Zarathustra, the advocate of life, the advocate of suffering, and the advocate of the circle. Heidegger explains these three in terms of a will that wills recurrence. Life means will to power as the fundamental trait of all beings, not merely human beings. Suffering means everything that suffers wills to live, and the circle means the sign of the ring that rings its way back to itself, and in that way always achieves recurrence of the same. As in Zarathustra's sign and vision of the proudest of animals, the eagle, circling in the heavens with the serpent, the wisest of animals, circling around his neck. In the convalescence, it is Zarathustra's animals who first articulate his task to him. You, Zarathustra, are the teacher of the eternal return. Recall that when Zarathustra first goes down to the marketplace to give his teaching, he does not yet teach eternal return, but rather the overman. The two core teachings of the entire book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, are thus underlined by Heidegger as the eternal return and the overman, and notes that Zarathustra does not himself utter this decisive phrase, at least not yet. You are the teacher of the eternal return, is what his animals tell him. On the mystery of Zarathustra's animals, how we are to understand them, Heidegger points to the sign and vision which Zarathustra had at the end of the prologue. In this mysterious embrace about the throat, in the eagle circling and the serpent's coiling, we can already sense the way the circle and ring tacitly wind around one another. Thus the ring scintillates, annulus eternitatis, the signal ring and year of eternity. At that time, Zarathustra pronounced, "These are my animals," and his heart was filled with joy. The proudest animal under the sun, and the most discerning animal under the sun. They have gone out on a search. They want to learn whether Zarathustra is still alive. Verily, am I still alive? I guess he was pretty disappointed by his reception from the people in the marketplace and the death of the tightrope walker. This begins the work with the task for Zarathustra to become who he is. So in a way, the whole work is a response to the sign given by Zarathustra's animals. And we find another note in these notebooks to this effect. Do I have time to wait for my animals? If they are my animals, they will know how to find me. Zarathustra's silence. The convalescent is set up against this backdrop of the end of the prologue. Zarathustra has become impatient in his path to who he is, and at the outset of the convalescent aims to awaken most abysmal thought. It is precisely at this point that his animals do find him and nurse him back to health. Like in Jung's reading of the dwarf, Heidegger emphasizes the independence of the animal's saying and its primordiality. They are urging Zarathustra to become who he is, only in the right way, not at the expense of his self-undoing. And Zarathustra shrinks in dismay before such becoming. Heidegger asks what this dismay is that haunts all Zarathustra's speeches, which often sounds presumptuous and often seems little more than frenzied extravaganza. It is not from the inspiration of Zarathustra that we will come to understand him, but rather from out of his startled dismay. And thus Heidegger turns to the opening of the convalescent. One morning, not long after his return to the cave, Zarathustra sprang up from his bed like a madman and cried with a terrible voice, and behaved as if someone else were lying on the bed and would not rise from it. And Zarathustra's voice rang out in such a way that his animals came to him in terror, and all the caves and hiding places in the neighborhood of Zarathustra's cave, all the creatures slipped away, flying, fluttering, creeping, jumping, according to the kind of foot or wing each had been given. Zarathustra, however, spoke these words. It's not hard to note in this opening of the convalescence a trace of what we would now understand as manic depression, if not even the onset of a type of schizotypal psychosis. In the vision and the riddle, Zarathustra had dragged his most abysmal thought up with him to his peak in the form of the dwarf, only to be thrown back into the depths of the shepherd's struggle with the black serpent, and overcoming this struggle, giving us a sign and an intimation of the overhuman. Here Zarathustra turns to the task of awakening his deepest thought, which as a human thought is deeper than the chthonic wisdom of the dwarf, or the protective veiling world of animality and nature. And thus his animals are terrified of him in this state. In a way, to learn to read Zarathustra is to become sensitive to the constant and profound transitions of health that are necessary if it is to be understood. The work as a whole, in light of the project first articulated in the gay science, attempts to present a kind of genealogy of Homo Natura, one that is articulated by and large throughout the work in the form of gestures. Recall how in the outset of the work, Zarathustra flows over and thus goes under. Here again he goes under, now into his most abysmal thought, which overwhelms him and leaves him devastated. What Zarathustra has been seeking throughout his mission is to provide the highest perspectival parable for time and becoming. Now approaching the climax of the work, the end of part 3, is time to awaken his most abysmal thought. And this will indeed lead, after his recovery, to the second dance song, the 7 seals, and later in part 4 of the work to the drunken song and the sign. Here and elsewhere, Zarathustra seeks a sight that is deeper than the world and before the gods, the chaos from which world and gods are engendered in the gestures of the creative body. Thus he writes in a letter to Peter Gast, "Today I learned by chance what Zarathustra means, star of gold." But in the convalescent we find little of dance except in the play of Zarathustra's animals. The animals have indeed taken on board the insight which was only dawning in the dwarf, that all things dance themselves. In the dwarf this was framed in terms of a deterministic paradigm. In the animals, a playful and innocent one. Let us look still more closely at these opening words. When Zarathustra springs from his bed like a madman and cries with a terrible voice, the German here is Schrei mit furchtbarer Stimme. Zarathustra's cry, or Geschrei, is what defines him as human, in relation to nature, the eternal recurrence, and his gestural body, or life. Gilles Deleuze will underline this aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy as central. What the dwarf and the animals represent are not the cries, Geschrei, of Zarathustra's original philosophy, as the prelude to Zarathustra's pure existence, but rather a form rather than the star of being. Zarathustra's voice resounded, toned, and it is this very tone that magnetizes and draws nearer to Zarathustra his dearest and most powerful animals, while scaring away the rest. His animals, however, are magnetized in a terror, erschreckt. So this terror is too great for any but Zarathustra's ownmost animals. It is precisely here, once he has gathered his animals to him, that Zarathustra speaks his word. Up, abysmal thought, up from your depths. I am the cockerel and dawn, sleepy worm, get up. My voice will crow you awake. Loosen the fetters of your ears, listen, for I want you to hear. Up, up, here is thunder enough to make even the graves listen. My voice is a medicine even for those born blind. And once you are awake, you shall stay awake forever. It is not my way to awaken great-grandmothers from sleep in order to bid them go back to sleep. Are you moving, stretching, rattling? Up, up. You shall not rattle, you shall not speak. Speak to me, Zarathustra, the godless calls you. I, Zarathustra, advocate of life, the advocate of suffering, the advocate of the circle. I call you, my most abysmal thought. Ah, you are coming, I hear you, my abyss speaks. I have turned my ultimate depth into the light. Come, give me your hand. Ha, don't. Disgust, disgust, disgust. Woe is me. As soon as Zarathustra uttered these words, he falls down like a dead man and remained a dead man for a long time. Heidegger underlines the disparity between Zarathustra's 2 responses to his ultimate thought. First, ah, you are coming, I hear you, my abyss speaks, I have turned my ultimate depth into the light, followed very quickly by disgust, woe is me. This circumscribes the character of the thought of thoughts. At once, Nietzsche's peak and abyss. As a thought of the peak, eternal recurrence is beautiful necessity. As a thought of the abyss, the most horrific possibility. And thus we find the onset of Zarathustra's ultimate abyss and depression. When he again came to himself, he was pale and trembling and remained lying down for a long time and would neither eat nor drink. This condition lasted 7 days. His animals, however, did not leave him day or night, except that the eagle flew off to fetch food, and whatever was collected was lain on Zarathustra's bed, so that at last Zarathustra lay among yellow and red berries, grapes, rosy apples, sweet-smelling herbs and pine cones. At his feet 2 lamps were spread. For 7 days Zarathustra's shattered consciousness lay being tended by his animals day and night. How could he go on living with this thought? Only through the power of active forgetting, being tended by his animals and convalescing in a garden of happiness, and therein making a new lyre and preparing new songs. The animals recall to Zarathustra everything they witnessed in his awesome cry and manic gesticulation, and they guide him step by step in his convalescence, welcoming him into his garden world and singing to him of the cycle of being, so as to lighten the pressure of his ultimate parable of time and becoming. Being versus becoming, Heraclitus versus Parmenides, come together here in the relation of Zarathustra, philosopher of life, suffering, the circle that is of becoming, and his animals, reminders of the being of the great year of becoming. At every stage, his animals honor his convalescence and prevent him from re-injuring himself in any way. What Zarathustra fears above all in his conversation with the animals is the return of the small man, of himself as the small man, indeed a last man. His threefold nausea refers back to the triad of life, suffering, and the circle, and indicates that for a moment he has ceased to be an advocate but has fallen away from his highest parable, indeed fallen into the delusive repetitions of his animals, of his garden world and of man. Indeed, Zarathustra will not succeed in attaining his lion playfulness and laughter until the end of Book 4 in the Sign. During his convalescence, what his animals urge Zarathustra to do is to learn to sing. That is, to fulfill his destiny as the teacher of the eternal return and the great year of becoming through song. Recall Nietzsche's own self-criticism of the birth of tragedy. It should have learned to sing this new soul. We can already see how this episode is full of quasi-shamanistic elements. Zarathustra, like a mad shaman, terrifies his animals at first, evokes the spirit of the depths, and collapses. The animals represent tone painting, the powers of nature that soothe and echo, and Zarathustra, humanity's greatest spirit and also greatest disgust. The animals heal Zarathustra during his dark night of the soul, but aren't able to approach his thought with him. They are a consolation to the convalescent. And thus Zarathustra says, "O my animals, go on talking and let me listen. Your talk is such refreshment. Where there is talking, the world is like a garden to me. How sweet it is that words and sounds of music exist. Are words and music not rainbows and seeming bridges between things eternally separated? These seeming bridges are shine bridges. For according to Nietzsche's doctrine of individuation, to every soul there belongs another world. For every soul, every other soul is like a back world. Among the most alike doth appearance deceive most beautifully, but the smallest cleft is hardest to bridge. Have not names and tones been given to things so that man can refresh himself by them? It is beautiful folly speaking. With it dances man over all things. How lovely is all talking and all deception of tones." Here Zarathustra explains in a series of questions his philosophy of individuation, becoming who you are in light of his most abysmal thought. And the animals respond to make light of his struggles. "O Zarathustra," they say, "all things themselves dance for those who think as we. They come and offer their hand and laugh and flee and return. Everything goes, everything returns, the wheel of existence rolls forever. Everything dies, everything blossoms anew, the year of existence runs on forever. Everything breaks, everything is joined anew, the same house of existence builds itself forever. Everything departs, everything meets again, the ring of existence is true to itself forever. Existence begins in every instance, the ball rolls there, rolls around every here, the middle is everywhere, the path of eternity is crooked." Note that after saying time is a circle, this is exactly what the dwarf also says. But how can time be both a circle and a crooked path through eternity? What the animals teach are the cycles of going and coming, dying and blooming, breaking and building, parting and greeting, which they respectively call the wheel, the year, the house, and the ring of being. For Zarathustra, this perspective has some acute limitations. In seeing the world only as a dance, the animals are blind to its origin in chaos, and this is why they are terrified and magnetized by Zarathustra's cry. Unlike Zarathustra, the animals know little about possibility. All they see is the necessary dance of the process of individuation. And thus Zarathustra insults them affectionately. "O ye buffoons and barrel organs, how well do you know what had to be fulfilled in 7 days? And have you already made a hurdy-gurdy song of it? How well you know how that monster crawled down my throat and suffocated me, but I bit off its head and spewed it out. And you, have you already made a hurdy-gurdy song of this? And you looked at it all, O my animals? Are you too cruel? Did you desire to be spectators of my great pain as men do? Being is not so creaturely as the animals make out. In fact, man is the cruelest of animals, At tragedies, bullfights, and crucifixions, he has so far felt best on earth. And it is here that Zarathustra reveals his hardest hope for man, that we should learn to increase our power of evil against the uncreaturely. And Zarathustra goes on at length about his disgust at the eternal recurrence of all that is worst in humanity. The advice which the animals give at this point is impeccable. Do not speak on, convalescent, but go to where the world awaits you like a garden. Go to the roses, the bees, the flocks of doves, but especially to the songbirds, that you may learn there how to sing. Singing is for the convalescent, only the healthy should speak. And when the healthy man wants songs, he wants other songs than those of the convalescent. O convalescent, prepare for thyself a lyre first, a new lyre. Sing and bubble over, O Zarathustra, heal thy soul with new lays, with new songs, that thou might bear thy great fate, which has been no one's fate, for thy animals know it well, who thou art and must become. Behold, thou art the teacher of the eternal recurrence. That is now thy fate. Again, it seems that the animals are correct here and not Zarathustra, for when he wakes, and for the rest of Book 3, what we receive is the triumphant finale of the work as a whole. And here Zarathustra learns a little from his animals about the art of existence, and thus ends Zarathustra's downgoing. According to Heidegger, if Zarathustra must first of all become the teacher of the eternal return, then he cannot commence with his doctrine straight away. But with the name Overman, Nietzsche is by no means designating a merely superdimensional human being, nor is he referring to a species of man that will cast off all that is humane, making naked willfulness its law and titanic rage its rule. Rather, the Overman, taking the word literally, is that human being who goes beyond prior humanity slowly in order to conduct such humanity for the first time to its essence, an essence that is still unattained, and to place humanity firmly within its essence. For Heidegger, Nietzsche is the first thinker to pose decisive questions concerning our current phase of world history, and the first to think through such questions in their metaphysical implications. Like it or not, we are the masters of the earth currently. The question is, what kind of humanity will we have to become in order to steward it well and become the meaning of the earth? Zarathustra is merely the teacher, not the Overman himself. Just as the serpent must become a dragon so that someone may become a hero against him, similarly, as a teacher, Zarathustra must become an advocate of the devil. For there are teachers that through and through only take things seriously when they have to do with their students. And this applies even to themselves. Zarathustra's becoming advocate and teacher is his truly serious task, but now for the rest of the work, we'll hear Zarathustra at play. And so stepping back from his startled dismay at humanity, so as to awaken in us a sense for the beginning or dawn, which may grant us as well a homecoming. Heidegger is keenly aware of this transition in part 3 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and so he next speaks of Nietzsche's thinking and poetizing as transitional, having to do with the Übergang, after the Untergang has been complete, and so as to prepare a dawning. The time of transition is one of great longing, Sehnsucht, or yearning, where yearning is the agony of the nearness of what lies afar. And so it seems that even for the thinker who famously declared that hope is evil, these last chapters of the work are deeply hopeful, horizontal, and a consolation, which attunes us to trust and to betrothal, to ourselves, to being, to all things in the universe. For that man might be redeemed from revenge, that is for me the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms. And immediately following, the convalescent is on the great longing or yearning, which begins, O my soul, I taught you to say today and someday and formerly, and to dance your round dance over every here and there and yonder. O my soul, I redeemed you from all little nooks, I swept away dust and spider and twilight from you. O my soul, I washed small bashfulness and nook virtue away from you and persuaded you to stand naked before the eyes of the sun. With the storm that is called spirit, I blew over your billowing sea. Every cloud I blew away, and I myself strangled the strangler that is called sin. Giving his soul very playful names like fate, circumference of circumferences, umbilical cord of time, and azure bell, and speaking to his own soul so poetically, wistfully, and primordially, leads Heidegger to wonder what Nietzsche's doctrine of the soul really was. According to Plato's teaching, a teaching that became definitive for Western metaphysics, the essence of thinking resides in the soul's solitary conversation with itself. The essence of thinking is logos, the telling self-gathering, wherein thought and speech are the same and the conversation of the soul with itself can proceed altogether in silence. This is what Heidegger calls thinking. Heidegger's deep critique of Nietzsche as the last metaphysician of the West is the furthest thing from a dismissal, or even from a limiting of Nietzschean thought to metaphysics. Rather, it points to an almost Heraclitean contradiction within Nietzsche's thought itself. On the one hand, the refrain, "Love alone will make it right," the creative love that forgets itself in the work and amor fati, and this is the Nietzsche with which we will never be finished. And on the other hand, the will to stamp becoming with the character of being as a supreme will to power. According to Heidegger, it is this latter form of thinking that does not, in fact, overcome the spirit of revenge, the it was. For the spirit of revenge remains active in this very stamping, which takes all becoming into the protection of eternal recurrence of the same, and is in itself a form of ill will against sheer transiency, and thereby a highly spiritualized spirit of revenge. Where Nietzsche went wrong, although Heidegger even hesitates to say this, is in the hope that eternal recurrence in the overman might bring us redemption from the spirit of revenge. For Nietzsche brought what is essentially metaphysical in his thinking to the extremity of ill will in the final lines of Ecce Homo, Have I Been Understood? Dionysus versus the Crucified. For Heidegger, this oft-touted opposition is simply not helpful. Where Nietzsche went right, however, and why Thus Spoke Zarathustra is an inexhaustible work because of its unity of pride and discernment, the eagle and the serpent. For Nietzsche, modesty and pride belong together quite closely. What they have in common is the cool, unflinching look of appraisal. And ultimately, for Heidegger, the riddle of who Zarathustra is, as a teacher of the eternal recurrence, is envisaged for us only in the spectacle of Zarathustra's animals. Nietzsche himself knew that his most abysmal thought remained a riddle, and in the face of it there are two routes of escape. One, either one averts that this thought of Nietzsche's is a kind of mysticism that our thinking should not bother to confront, or one avers that this thought is as old as the hills and that it boils down to the long familiar cyclical notion of cosmic occurrence. Despite the problems in Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence, of course, Heidegger will not take either of these two escape routes. For what he sees in the essence of modern power machine-driven technology is one ongoing offshoot of Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal recurrence of the same. The essence of such machines is neither something machine-like nor anything mechanical. Rather, it brings to fruition the dark side of the spiritual world expressed in Nietzsche's doctrine. That Nietzsche interpreted and experienced his most abysmal thought in terms of the Dionysian only speaks for the fact that he still thought it metaphysically and had to think it this way. Yet it says nothing against the fact that this most abysmal thought conceals something unthought, something which at the same time remains a sealed door to metaphysical thinking. Heidegger's Nietzsche and Zarathustra in particular can be defined as the convalescing from metaphysics, which occurs when Zarathustra makes good on his promise to his animals to sing. Above all, 3 closing chapters of Part 3, which I would consider to be Nietzsche's best writing and poetry. O man, attend, what does deep midnight's voice contend? I slept my sleep, and now awake at dreaming's end. The world is deep, deeper than day can comprehend. Deep is its woe, joy deeper than heart's agony. Woe says, hence go, but all joy wants eternity, wants deep, profound eternity. The 7 Seals, or Yes and Amen song, is the finale of the work and is divided into 7 parts. 1 on the prophetic spirit and the heights, 2 on the graves of history, the old gods and the new world, 3 on spiritual creativity and the round dance, 4 on the mixing of all things and the alchemy of redemption, 5 on the ocean of eternity and our consolation, 6 on the virtue of dance in body and spirit, and 7 on learning to fly in the ethers of freedom. In the second finale to Thus Spoke Zarathustra as a whole, the end of Book 4, which otherwise is something of an anticlimax, and after the night song, we get the chapter named The Sign. Here, once again, Zarathustra steps forth from his cave and greets the morning sun. After receiving the sign that it is time to go down, Zarathustra, having overcome his last temptation, that is pity for the superior humans, again begins his descent. He departs his cave glowing and strong, like a morning sun coming out of dark mountains, and says, "My eagle is awake, like me, does honor to the sun. With eagle's claws it reaches out for new light. You are my rightful animals, I love you, but I still lack my rightful men." Thus spoke Zarathustra. Then, however, he suddenly heard that he was surrounded by countless birds swarming and fluttering. The whirring of so many wings and the throng about his head were so great that he shut his eyes, and truly it was as if a cloud had fallen upon him, a cloud of arrows discharged over a new enemy, and behold, in this case, it was a cloud of love over a new friend. "What is happening to me?" thought Zarathustra in his astonished heart, and slowly lowered himself on to the great stone that lay beside the exit of his cave. But as he was clutching about above and beneath himself, warding off the tender birds, behold, then something even stranger occurred. For in so doing, he clutched unawares a thick, warm mane of hair. At the same time, however, a great roar rang out in front of him, the gentle, protracted roar of a lion. "The sign has come," said Zarathustra, and his heart was transformed. The doves, however, were no less eager than the lion with their love, and every time a dove glided across the lion's nose, the lion shook its head and wondered and laughed. While this was happening, Zarathustra said but one thing, "My children are near, my children," and then he grew quite silent. "What has been reserved for me as my ultimate sin?" And once more Zarathustra, absorbed in himself, sat up again on the great stone and meditated, and suddenly he leapt up. "Pity, pity for the higher man," he cried out, and his countenance was transformed into brass. "Very well, that has had its time. For do I aspire after happiness? I aspire after my work. Very well, the lion has come, my children are near, Zarathustra has become ripe, my hour has come. This is my morning, my day begins. Rise up now, rise up, great noontide." Thus spoke Zarathustra thus concludes as a whole with a call to the great noontide. One of Nietzsche's first articulations of this central thought is in the notebooks of 1873. He to whom an active and stormy morning of life is allotted, at the noontide of life feels his soul overcome by a strange longing for a rest that may last for months and years. All grows silent around him, voices sound further and further in the distance, the sun shines straight down upon him. On a hidden woodland sward, he sees the great god Pan sleeping, and with Pan, nature seems to him to have gone to sleep, with an expression of eternity on their faces. He wants nothing, he troubles for nothing, his heart stands still, only his eyes live. It is a death with waking eyes. Then a man sees much that he never saw before, and so far as his eye can reach, all is woven into and as it were buried in a net of light. He feels happy, but it is a heavy, very heavy kind of happiness. Then at last the wind stirs in the trees. Noontide is over. Life carries him away again. Life with its blind eyes and its tempestuous retinue behind it. Desire, illusion, oblivion, enjoyment, destruction, and decay. And so comes evening, more stormy and more active than was ever the morning. To the really active man, these prolonged phases of thought seem almost uncanny and morbid, but not unpleasant. I think the biggest takeaway from Nietzsche's bold new philosophy is well expressed in Gilles Deleuze, from the earliest essays to the later interviews, where he describes his own attempts and the chapters of Thus Spoke Zarathustra's as little ritornellos, or little territorial songs, songs that birds sing, the great song of the earth when the earth cries out, the the powerful harmony of the spheres or the voice of the cosmos. That is, in any case, what Deleuze and Nietzsche attempt to do, create little lighters, corresponding to each plateau in the plane of immanence or becoming. Quote, "For us, philosophy is nothing but music, from the most humble melody to the grandest of songs, a sort of cosmic Sprechgesang, or speech song. The owl of Minerva, to borrow from Hegel, has its screeches and its songs. The principles in philosophy are screeches, around which concepts develop their songs." Heidegger as well derives this deepest lesson from Nietzsche in his lectures, Introduction to Philosophy, Poetizing and Thinking, when he quotes the postlude to Beyond Good and Evil, again a short book of songs, and where Nietzsche sings, "This song is over, the sweet cry of longing died in my mouth. A magician did it, a friend at the right hour, the midday friend, no, do not ask who it is. It was around midday when one turned into two. Now we are celebrating, certain of unified victory, the festival of festivals. Friend Zarathustra came, the guest of guests. Now the world laughs, the dread curtain torn. The marriage came for light and darkness." For Heidegger, Nietzsche's philosophizing is at the same time a poetizing, and the key to understanding it requires us to walk on both these paths. This notion of philosophy as a kind of cosmic Sprechgesang and ritornello, I think, should be our most helpful takeaway from this study of Nietzsche's peaks, abysses, and songs. If you get more interested in Nietzsche's poetry after listening to this lecture, don't just read the end of Zarathustra Part 3, but also pick up this anthology of Nietzsche's poetry, The Peacock and the Buffalo, translated by James Lucht. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.